The Soviet Union by David, Tristan, and Connor.
The Soviet Union and Communist Idea. The Soviet Union's roots can be traced back to the days of World War I, and before that, Karl Marx. The communist idea came from the book called the Communist Manifesto that was created by Karl Marx, and it states there would be a conflict with the business owners, the bourgeois, and the proletariat, workers. This conflict would eventually boil over to a revolution that would see the proletariat controlling the government. The reason why this is important is because the idea sparked a revolution in Russia called the Russian Revolution of 1917. This revolution was headed by a man named Vladimir Lenin. All I need to know is initially there were two governments named the Provisional Government and the Petrograd Soviet. These two governments competed with each other and seemed like the Provisional Government would become the true government. Lenin intervened and all became a convoluted mess that led to the Civil War happening. The Petrograd Soviet won and the Soviet Union was born. The first 5-year plan of the Soviet Union was to create a quick and large-scale industrialization across the Union. In order to attain a very strong industrial presence, modern machinery was adapted across the country. To ensure that the country's food supply could support the new population of workers, the Soviet leader known as Stalin began a policy known as collectivization. This new policy was ideally supposed to coordinate and unite the independent farmers all across the nation and allow a greater amount of produce to be produced and efficiency to be increased. In reality, it was a complete disaster as the kulaks were the main targets of this collectivization and they got placed in a gulag. In putting competent and knowledgeable farmers in a gulag and replacing them with workers who didn't want to work on a farm drastically reduced efficiency and productivity, resulting in the deaths of millions due to a famine.
Soviet Union's leaders. The Soviet Union had 8 leaders during its existence from 1922 to 1991. Unlike countries in which a president or prime minister is designated head of state, the Soviet Union's leaders mostly assumed power by becoming the head of state for the Soviet Union's Communist Party. The men who ruled the USSR the most were Joseph Stalin and Leonid Brezhnev, who each served several decades as the head of the Communist Party. Lesser-known leaders, such as Georgy Malenkov, who lost power to Nikita Khrushchev after only a few weeks. Then there's Konstantin Chernyavsky, who died only being in office for a year. In some way, these 8 men shaped the USSR. Soviet impact during World War II. Soviet impact during World War II can be traced back to September of 1939, when the German Reich signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. This non-aggression pact stipulated that they both invaded Poland and that both the Germans and Soviets would gain land in Eastern Europe. The Soviets annexed the Baltics and gained some of Poland, while Germany got the rest. This non-aggression pact would not last when the Germans initiated Operation Barbarossa against the Soviets and started a bloody campaign against the Soviet Union that resulted in the total death of more than 20 million during World War II.
Soviets after World War II and the Cold War. The aftermath of World War II left the Soviets reeling. A total of over 15% of the Soviet population died during the war, and much of the Western Soviet Union was left devastated by the German atrocities. Though, after the war, they were able to gain much of Eastern Europe and establish them as a buffer zone against their now rival capitalist. This kickstarts the Cold War and the conflict between the communists and the capitalists. Many different espionage operations happened during this time, and they were constantly spying on each other. This coincided with technological competition between the two, and this resulted in the Soviets launching a rocket into space and becoming the first nation to launch a man into space. The collapse of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union started to collapse in most part due to their nigh crippling military spending and the extreme inefficiencies happening in the Soviet Union. Technology wasn't being used in Soviet factories like computers, and their innovative metallurgy was being sold off, taking away another one of their advantages against capitalists. Pair this with the worsening living conditions and press censorship, and you'd have yourself the Soviet Union in the 1980s. This lack of improvement and the continual loss of the Cold War, including losing the possibility of them having the first person on the moon,